Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
So just very briefly, like as many people on here probably already know a little bit about the history, I'll just kind of run through it quickly and like kind of lay out what our objectives are as an organization. So, you know, TWT started in 2016, and like a lot of you might have seen, we celebrated our 5th anniversary last Thursday, which is really exciting. When the doors first opened in 2016, we had no idea that it would go beyond those 4 days at conference. So it's amazing that we're still here. And, you know, the aim of that first event really was to create a space at Conference Fringe for all the different parts of the left, whether that's socialist MPs, Labour Party members, grassroots activists, from social movements, and people who are like new to politics and inspired by Corbyn's leadership to come together, debate, discuss and strategize, as well as build relationships going forward. You know, and since then it's become like a fixture at conference every year. And I think like kind of what came out of that first festival was just a set of key objectives really, which were, you know, keeping a radical vision on the table. A lot of people were inspired by Corbyn's leadership because of the kind of utopian and radical possibilities it offered, and we wanted to create a space where that could be nurtured. We also wanted to create a space where like different parts of the movement could come together, exchange ideas, skills, information, etc., as well as really embed arts and culture at the center of that. So a key part of TWT, which is always developing, is the arts program and expanding the idea of political discussion through different like cultural forms. And then the other key thing I think was creating a space where we could start to develop a much healthier left culture, you know, that would be participatory, but would also allow space for, you know, comradely debate where disagreement could happen, but not in the kind of toxic way that we see on Twitter. And, you know, so that's the kind of key objectives. But quite quickly after the first year, we realized that, you know, you can only do so much over 4 days. And we wanted to start developing the organization so it was useful all year round, particularly around the idea of building political education. So I think a lot of people have acknowledged this, but like it was a lack within the Corbyn project over the last 5 years that we didn't really have the kind of political education and the institutions delivering that and driving that forward that we needed. And that was primarily because, you know, we've seen over the last 40 years in neoliberalism, much of the traditional institutions that offered that, whether that's the trade unions, socialist clubs, or the Labour Party itself, had been hollowed out. So there was a real dearth. So from 2017-18 onwards, we started to concentrate our work on developing political education all year round. And we started to see the emergence of these transform groups, these just coming up organically all across the country. The first one being Derby Transform, that I guess were inspired by TWT to a certain extent, but, you know, started to develop those objectives within different localities. And over the last year, we've seen over 30 groups emerge in all across the country. And during the festival, you know, we've had events run by Brent, Glasgow, Tyndale, Norfolk and Southwark Transform. So that's really exciting. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but in summary, you know, what we're doing at the moment is that we've built a resource hub to bring together resources for people to run political education. We've started running trainings. We've got 2 key trainings now, one called Political Education Transformed, which is about supporting organizers and educators to move beyond kind of, you know, the standard panel format and think about what it means to develop transformative education, and one more practically about how you can run your own transformed event, and a few other things that I'll talk about later. within that kind of aim, we also wanted TWT to become a space where reflection around what good political education means could take place, where we could bring together organisers and educators who are doing brilliant work in different parts of the movement to exchange ideas, etc. And we wanted to learn ourselves, right, as an education organisation. And so as part of that, we managed to get some funding from the Emil Melbourne Trust to host a research fellowship on political education over the last year. And actually myself and Fiona Ranford started doing it together, but I then got this job as the National Operations Coordinator for the World Transformed. So Fiona has taken it on and is in the process of completing it herself and has done an amazing job. So I'm going to just hand over to her quickly to explain a little bit about that.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so nice to see you all online. Yeah, as Charlie said, me and a bunch of other awesome activists and researchers have been working for over a year now on this project, which is trying to get a fuller understanding of the nature of transformative political education that's happening in the UK today. What kinds of projects and initiatives people are organising, and I'm sure that lots of you on the call today have been involved in some really interesting projects. What is working well and what challenges people are facing in doing this work. So we had a survey of over 90 organisations and projects. We carried out in-depth case studies of some amazing organisations, including Trademark, who are with us today. And we interviewed a lot of organisers and activists from different spaces. So people from activist groups and collectives to community organisations, trade unions, political parties, faith-based organisations and arts organisations. So really thinking about what's going on in all kinds of different spaces. And we're hoping that the results will, like this session, assist the sharing of knowledge and expertise between educators, activists, organisers, about powerful forms of political education, and also help to shape the kind of support that TWT can offer in order to build a stronger culture of political education on the left. And so we're really looking forward to hopefully sharing those results with you over the next few months. Before we launch into our amazing speakers, we thought it would be helpful just to define a little bit about what we mean when we talk about political education, because it really brings lots of things to mind when you say that term, and it is contested. And so we're thinking about education that helps people to understand politics in its broadest sense, and not just about learning about political parties or what's going on in Westminster, even though that's important, but a much broader sense of politics, about how systems of power work in our lives and in society at all levels to exclude and rob and oppress, and also to work to liberate and to transform our lives for the better. And we also know that education happens about society, happens in all kinds of places, in conversations with friends and family, informal education and through self-education. And in the research, this came up loads, people talking about how much they're learning through blogs and podcasts and reading. And we also learn things as we go. We learn as we organise, and we learn in our activism. But today, and in TWT, we usually use the term to refer to sort of non-compulsory political education that takes the form of intentional group learning. And there's lots that could be said, and which is interesting in the research, about the ongoing importance of bringing people together in learning communities, like we're doing today. And the final thing I wanted to mention is that the political education we're thinking about today isn't education that just aims to bring people together to reflect and understand the world, but explicitly aims to transform it. And there's nothing neutral about the political education we're talking about here. And our understanding is that political education is never neutral. And so we need to do education that is on the side of those who are being screwed over. It's education that is for justice and for collective liberation. And the fantastic speakers with us today are educators and organisers who are deeply involved in education for social transformation, and drawing on different histories and traditions of transformative political education and organising. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Fiona. That was a brilliant summary and definition of political education, and I think we're all really looking forward to seeing the research. Yeah, so thank you very much. Okay, so just before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to just remind everyone of the kind of basic principles of given this is going to be quite a participatory session, just and we're all kind of fighting for the same thing, I hope. Just assume, we have some basic ground rules, assumption of goodwill. If you disagree with someone, that's obviously completely fine, but try and express that in a spirit of kindness and respect. Listen more than you talk, step up, step back. If you're someone who doesn't feel that confident in speaking, take a bit of a risk. And equally, if you're someone who tends to speak quite a lot, just try and step back occasionally and listen to what others are saying. Call out bigotry. This is, as TWT generally is, a pluralist space, and we encourage comradely debate, but bigotry will be challenged. And yeah, you're going to have facilitators in your group, and just try and be nice to them, basically. Be patient with them. Okay, I think I have loads more to say that I wanted to say, but I think I'm going to leave it there and come back at the end, because I really want to just hear from the speakers, really. So yeah, really excited by this group of speakers. One thing I did want to say is that we've had a lot of we've had a lot of events in the past that have kind of quibbled over the definition and meaning of political education, and I think what we really want to focus on today is strategies going forward, how we can start to embed this in our work. We've heard the analysis many times over of the defeat of the election and the importance of building political education going forward. And I think it's really important we just take that seriously now. We have to do it, and we have to find ways to, really embed that in all the work we do. So bearing that in mind. Okay, so we have 3 speakers who are organising and running political education in quite different contexts. It's really exciting. We have Dami McKinday, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of We Belong, an organisation that fights for young migrants to be treated equally and fairly in a society they call home. We have Jana Graham. Jana is a lecturer and researcher at Goldsmiths College. She works with histories of popular education and militant research in relation to current day struggles around migration, gentrification and anti-racism. She's a co-author of the book How Conflicts in the Media Make Migrants, published by Manchester University Press. And we have Stevie O'Neilan. Sorry, Stevie, you're going to correct me in a moment for saying that wrong. Stevie works for Trademark Belfast, a trade union-based organisation focused on political education, alternative economics and post-conflict transformation. Transform Belfast have been an amazing partner to this year's festival as well. And you can catch their workshop, So the Economy is Tanking, What Does It Mean?, on our YouTube channel. And I'd also really recommend checking out their podcast, which I'm sure Stevie will talk about. So no further ado, I will hand over to Dami, who is our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm really hoping everybody can hear me okay, just because I'm outside and it's slightly noisy in my background. But if you can't, please do let me know, and I'm happy to repeat anything. But yeah, thank you. As mentioned by Charlie, my name is Dami. I am the co-CEO of an organisation called We Belong. It's an organisation that started as an education campaign, but developed into something so much more because of the impunitive barriers that was forced upon young, stopped most of us, including myself, who is a young migrant, from living a fulfilled life as the Britons that we really are in everything except paperwork. So the barriers, ranged from access to education to cost of home office fees and to 10-year probation period that it takes people like us to get to citizenship once we start our legal journey. And the list I've mentioned is by no means exhaustive. and we, you know, we can be here for a while if I continue to mention all of them. Just to give a quick context about the cohort of young people that I'm talking about. You know, we are usually we are not migrants who have arrived in the UK at such a young age through, you know, no fault of our own, and are caught within the immigration cycle for various different reasons. But We've particularly works with young migrants aged 16 to 24. But, you know, in driving change, we've had to ensure that we are heard, and we've used many tools to also combat our problems. If I take us back to 2015, you know, the government was taken to court because they tried to stop lawful young migrants who had bright futures in the UK from accessing funds that they need to further their higher education. And we won that battle as we campaigned outside the Supreme Court, coming out in, you know, collective forces and showing.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, Amy, but would you mind just talking a little bit slower? Just because of the background noise, it'd be super helpful if you could talk a tiny bit slower so we can hear you a bit better.
Yeah, no,
thank you.
No worries at all. Do apologise for that. Okay, sorry about that. So I was from saying, you know, in driving change, I'm just reminded of the 2015 court case that we had, where we took the government to court because they were stopping lawful young migrants who had amazing futures from accessing funds that they really needed to carry on and further their higher education. We won that battle because we campaigned outside the Supreme Court, coming out together collectively to ensure that, you know, the court knew that we took the case seriously. But even before that court case heard what the case would be like, how we need to educate the public, what type of media was going to be present. And we'd rehearsed what could go wrong, what could go right. We'd rehearsed our stories. We'd rehearsed everything to ensure that, you know, we were using all the tools to ensure that we made sure that this battle really was won, and in the best case scenario. And, you know, I'm proud to say that we did win that battle, because not just because of, you know, the great allies and the MPs that were there to wish us well, but also because it was found on a discriminatory level. You know, we've since been educating the public since then, you know, the government about one another, about, you know, the system. We've been educating one another and the government about the systematic barriers in which we face and how it can be changed. And we do that through, you know, holding parliamentary events, as we believe is so important for MPs to be able to hear the stories of hardship that they put in young people through specifically. And, you know, we produce reports and use the power of media to further educate the public on what is really happening. And I hope that the public will stand and support us in being the change that we all want to see. But political education in any tools that we use has by no means been easy, because everybody has their own idea of what they think the immigration system particularly is like. You know, so most of the time we're often confused with asylum seeking migrants, or told that us being in this situation is simply our fault, without realizing the complexity of the immigration system and how lawyers themselves find it hard to keep up with the regulations, let alone young people. But there's also, you know, the good migrant, bad migrant rhetoric that we were trying to break down in so many ways, and using different tools to try and combat that. And as soon as, you know, there's an understanding that you're not an asylum seeking migrant because you're not fleeing the public also quite quick to think that, or their attitude is quite quick to change in that, or you don't deserve to be here again, playing into the good migrant, bad migrant rhetoric, you know, go by different means, and ensuring that we can shift those who are away in moving left once the understanding is thought about. So our strategies, we've had strategies of lobbying the government, where we ensure that we attend various different meetings with young people, and also ensure that our agenda is consistently, we are consistently on their agenda. So we would always use, you know, tools of story of self, which is developed by Marshall Gantz. You know, this tool was developed so that people can better understand our like one another's struggles, because no one can really tell your own story better than you can, right? So it was designed to empower others to join in the fight with you, or at least have a foundational level of empathy. So we have found that this has been super effective. When you own in on your story and you talk about your story, you can use it as a tool. So to connect with others emotionally, but to also for them to also join you in the fights that you were bringing. And also we've realized that this tool in Story of Self has been really helpful in healing with one another. The more we talk about our story, the more that we feel that we are being restored, and the pain, and the more that the pain, even though it's still there, it doesn't have the same effect or hold us as it did previously. So it's very important. Political education is very important on many different levels, because I definitely believe that without it, true change cannot come. It also allows us to work cross sectors and enhance the conversations, ideas, and strategies. It allows more space for collaboration for work and to deepen various different knowledges. So those are the things that I'm here to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dami. That was brilliant. Yeah, that's an amazing example of building political education into a campaign. I think that, and I love that idea of a kind of foundational idea of empathy, which is something that is much needed, I think, generally at the moment. There's a couple of questions, if you're still there. First of all, I think this is a really great question from Max. How wide of a target audience is worth educating about migrant solidarity? Are efforts wasted on people who are already strongly anti-immigrant? And if not, how can we reach them? Did you hear that?
Yes, sorry. That is a really, really important. That was a really good question. How wide can the reach go? For us, this is a topic that's national. We try to reach the nation, the UK, and even to the point where we're trying to teach Americans, go overseas and teach them about the culture in the UK when it comes to migrants. So we try to ensure that everybody we come in contact with are being taught. So whether it's whether it's school, at conferences, meetings, no matter who it is, we're trying to reach as many people as possible in ensuring that everybody understands what the culture is like when it comes to migration in the UK, because it is a national topic, and so therefore people should know about it nationally. And we've gotten the second question. If somebody doesn't mind reminding me, that would be awesome.
So I guess the second part of that question was is it worth trying to educate people who are actively anti-immigrant?
Yeah, so I think there was a study that came out, I think quite recently or just a while ago, on people who are so there are three sets of people in society. There are those who are completely anti-migrant, and there are those in the middle, and then there are those who are always going to be for migration. And it's important to not necessarily focus on the people who are anti-immigration, because they will most likely be set in their ways, and they won't try to change who they are. Whereas with the middle people, you can always try and sway them. So I then, on being anti-immigration and not understand and not want to, or isn't willing to understand the nature of migration and how it works, and then I don't believe that I believe that it's pointless wasting our time in trying to educate them. We could try to educate them in other ways and in other means, but that conversation would need to take place quite differently to how we would speak to the people in the middle, very far left.
Great, thanks, Dami. I've got one more question, and it's around this idea of educating MPs. Jess says that's a really interesting idea, that you can politically educate MPs by asking them to hear the stories of young people you're working with. Who tends to show up to those events, and is it already those who are on our side? And I think this is a broader question that we've probably not done enough work round as the left in terms of like how we educate our MPs and the kind of political education programs that you know, they're involved in. Yeah. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, very interesting question. So with the MPs, we hold parliamentary events every year to educate MPs. This year, we've been very fortunate to have Conservative MPs because usually they say no to us and they don't want to hear. But it was so important for us that as the government that is making the rules on these issues, you need to know the impact that it is having on the young people that you're enforcing these rules upon. So for us, it was so important. And MPs, you know, were there. Conservative, we were fortunate to have 2 Conservative MPs who were also quite shocked at the fact that young migrants were treated this way. And just migrants in general were treated in such a horrifying way. And you know, they made promises to us that they would go back to their party and ensure that things do change. But of course, we will know through their actions when they step up on the plate. But it just goes to show that you know, MPs do need educating. MPs often bring out laws that they don't realize what the impact is going to be. To hear the stories of how their laws are impacting others, it's very unlikely that that will change.
All right, thanks a lot, Demi. That was amazing, and yeah, even with all the sound in the background, I think it came across really clearly. And yeah, I think I was just thinking like one thing there that would be definitely good to talk about in the breakout groups is this idea of how like personal stories can play a role within political education. And I think we saw that like, so Momentum and others like during the election campaign really tried to kind of develop these canvassing techniques that, you know, put your own personal story at the you know, the kind of like way in. And I think, yeah, it'd be great to hear people discuss that, you know, like effective ways of doing that, but also some of the limitations of doing that, I think, within their group. So I'm going to park that there and put it for people to discuss. But yeah, thank you very much, Demi. We'll go to Stevie next.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Well, glad to get it over and done with. Well, I'll just kick off, Charlie. Thanks very much for the invitation. My name's Stefan Newline from Trademark Belfast. We're the anti-sectarian unit of the Irish Labour Movement, which is a kind of weird title and strange that we would be here talking about political education, but there is a story behind it. I want to congratulate TWT at the first for their 5th anniversary and all the brilliant work they've done since 2016. It's so important for so many of us that there's somebody at least trying to reintroduce political education back into the spaces from which it's been driven over the last 40 years. And to recolonize those spaces with socialist thinking and socialist ideas so we can kind of stand up and say, you know, make us talk and think like the socialists we always claim to be. And that's really important. It can't be underestimated. In regards to our work here in Ireland, our traditional work has been in the peace process, and particularly in providing a trade union response to the conflict here. And that usually means interventions in workplaces and responding to intimidation or threats against workers by paramilitaries or indeed by state security forces. And that work, of course, has taken us into communities as well, working with ex-combatants, ex-prisoner groups, community groups, paramilitary organisations. Indeed, there's no one we won't work with, and there's nowhere we won't go. That's kind of almost our motto. And that work over the last 25 years has tended not to reify the kind of ethno-nationalist identities that exist here, but to, you know, that have existed, that are kind of historically resilient, to put it mildly, with the assistance of British imperialism, of course, although I think that's now called overseas operations, but we'll leave that one there for next time. We focus rather on the material conceptions of history, of class, of capitalism, of imperialism. But even at that work that we do in Northern Ireland, it's a form of political education that's very contextual to this place, to Northern Ireland. Which, to contradict Thatcher, is not as British as Finchley, unless the Finchley Popular Front are rearming themselves and going back on a campaign of violence. I doubt that's true. The style of intervention we use, some of the content maybe, isn't very transferable. That's the truth of it. And it's maybe not useful for people aside from perhaps other conflict zones. But all of that changed in 2008 with the global financial crash. And we were approached by those very same groups, but this time also by trade union organisations in Britain and in Ireland because of our connections through Unite. I'm a member of Unite. And they asked us kind of what the fuck just happened and can you explain it? And our first response was, no, go back to your unions. They have the skills, the capacity, the resources to do that for you. But it became very clear very quickly that unions had suffered that same colonisation of their thinking as had every other institution in society. That, in the words of David Harvey, everyone thinks like a neoliberal, even when we don't want to. And so there was no one in those spaces that was providing the answers, the education, knowledge that people were really demanding. And very quickly it became an important part of our work. And a big shout out, by the way, to the Unite Political School at Durham, who had us over on multiple occasions, and Danny Freeman down in London, who opened every door he could for us into the union movement to try and change the way trade unions deliver political education, which had become dominated by free market thinking and skills-based education and improving your CV and getting on in life, as opposed to building a collective organisation to challenge capital, which I assumed was the purpose of trade unions. In Ireland, our kind of work developed at a similar pace, but all of that changed in 2015 with the emergence of the Right to Water campaign. And we witnessed a fairly sudden, organic and rapid politicisation of a really unprecedented mobilisation, actually, of working class communities across the state, responding to the installation of water meters outside every house in the country, and of course the eventual privatisation of that system. A very small number of unions came on board: Unite, the Communication Workers Union of Ireland, Mandate, which is a retail and bar workers union, and they kind of provided resources for the campaign. They provided a bit of structure for it, a bit of political strategy, and they gave kind of a formal expression to what were up until that point local efforts, and they created really a massive social movement that had a massive impact on Irish history. And the traditional two parties here, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, normally get about 90% of the electoral vote. That dropped to below 50% 5 years ago for the first time in 100 years. So it opened up a massive space on the left in Irish politics. There were massive national demonstrations, local demonstrations. There was a well-coordinated social media campaign, the usual things you expect with a campaign. The difference was this time we actively went out and recruited a kind of cohort, quite a large cohort initially, of about 50 or 60 people of local, you might call them organic leaders from communities, selected by the local group themselves. We brought them up to Dublin, up to the Big Smoke, and we put on 3-day intensive political courses over the space of about a year to dozens and dozens of groups. And the purpose of that really was to build the capacity of those groups to understand why they were resisting the installation of water meters and the privatisation of water. And the message was that alongside financial deregulation, alongside attacks on trade unions, alongside free trade agreements and free trade zones, this was about the privatisation of water for profit in an era of water insecurity. The UN said in 2010 that 2/3 of the world's population won't have access to water security, and 2 billion won't have access to fresh drinking water by 2027. Now, to you and me, that's a humanitarian disaster. But to this sociopathic system and the sociopaths that own it, that's simply an opportunity to own more assets, build their wealth, extract more wealth, and of course influence our political processes and political institutions at the same time. That political education program then went on the road for 2 years. Hundreds of sessions, 1 hour, 3 hour, 1 day up to 3 day intensive sessions in all around the country, in pubs, in clubs, in sports halls, in religious community centres. And the focus was always political economy. That's what we chose to do. That's all we did. We didn't talk about anything else. And why? Because understanding the economic system, understanding what it does, how it does it to us, understand that it's not a natural system, there's a political construct that has a history and it has a context, a system in which increasingly we have no say. It's not so much a free market as an economic tyranny when you hand over all of the key entrance points to your economy to private individuals and to oligarchs and to shareholders. We also recognise at the same time that the politicisation we were seeing wasn't necessarily going to develop in a left-wing or progressive direction with a kind of sudden blossoming of class consciousness. The Right to Water movement, like many of these single-issue movements, was populist. 75% of the hundreds of thousands of people involved had never been involved in any political activity before, were not members of political parties. Most of them didn't even vote in elections. And around the edges of that movement, you had kind of reactionary elements. You had anti-vaxxers, anti-taxers, conspiracy theorists, failed business people, talking about crony capitalism and corruption, the language that we now know as the language of the new right. And so you had these reactionary elements around the edges of that populist movement. And it was our job really to police those edges, to convince those people, or indeed exclude them, that reactionary element from the programme, but also then to channel that discontent and anger in a left-wing direction. And we did that by providing them with a kind of politically economic framework to understand their experiences through. If you like, that last one of the last scenes in the Yellow Brick Road, when they pull back the green velvet curtain and the wizard's in there pulling all of the levers, that was our job, you know, helping people understand how the world actually works as opposed to how we're told it works. The end of the campaign was a kind of a partial victory. It hasn't been privatised, although it's on the agenda of the new government, which includes the Irish Green Party, by the way. I thought I'd get that one in there. And we didn't lose the political impact, but we did lose the impetus. And there's a really important lesson in that, because those edges that we were policing have now drifted off to form a very active far right in Ireland. And it's a perfect example, crystallised, of what happens when you work with people, but then when you abandon people. And what we did in kind of 2 years, you could argue you've done in 40 years. We've abandoned working class communities, we've abandoned people, and they feel isolated, they feel atomised, they don't feel like they belong to anything. And to quote someone, Daniel Singer, if we don't provide rational solutions to the very real problems people are facing, then the right's going to provide irrational solutions. And that kind of sums up what we're seeing in so many different places around the world at the moment. In terms of what it might help and how it might help, I suppose, in terms of how political education might help the left, the left, or the organised political left, is on the retreat in so many places. It's largely isolated from the working class it claims to represent. As Charlie mentioned in the introduction, many, if not all, of those working class institutions have disappeared, along with the jobs that went with them, of course. That's a product, of course, of deindustrialisation. A very good friend of ours, Paul O'Connell, who some of you know, works at SOAS, he said that you can imagine, you know, the 300 miners' libraries that used to exist in Wales in the 1930s and 40s, where after a 12-hour shift, people used to meet up to discuss the merits of Das Kapital. We have nothing like that. Instead, what we have is a plethora of excellent NGOs producing brilliant work on alternative socialist and you know, eco-socialist futures. But too many of those great organisations have no roots in the communities, you know, that they need, whose agency we need to change this society. And there's a huge disconnect there. And it's not just political distance, it's also geographical distance. We literally don't live there anymore. I was at a Dilinka conference last year, and one of the young activists asked me, how do you get to these people? And that was the fucking problem. You talked about them as if they were a different race of people living in a different space than the one that she lived in, which was a kind of reified academic middle-class area. And that is a real problem that we need to address. One of our problems is that we don't have the people or the institutions to translate some of these socialist ideas into those communities. We saw it with what did Len McCluskey call it, the kind of policy incontinence of the last Labour manifesto. Brilliant ideas, people didn't believe them. People didn't understand them. People didn't think they were important to their lives. And so we need organisations, structures, individuals to be able to translate some of our ideas to people who have lost the ability to listen and don't trust us. And so I suppose those perfect storm conditions have exposed that there's a real dearth of serious political education, both amongst us, people who are actively organising and teaching on the left, but also amongst workers and communities. The trade union movement has a massive role to play here, and it's kind of, I don't want to get too personal, but it's abdicating a huge responsibility by not addressing the free market, individualised CV building education that it provides its members, as opposed to providing education on political economy and building a collective organisation that can collectively challenge power. And we need presence in communities that we don't have. And I don't see anyone, I hope, going to learn today. I don't see where that's coming from at the moment. So there is a job at hand. And it's not a job that can be tied to electoral cycles of every 4 or 5 years, by the way. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a lot longer than that. And it's a lot harder road to take. And I'll leave it there. Gormaigi, thanks.
Excellent. I don't think anyone speaks so powerfully about these issues as I've heard you speak recently. A couple of quick questions. So I've just got one from myself really quickly, which is, it's a big question and maybe we can come back to it later. But I just obviously you laid out a lot of the problems there, and you know, the lack of institutions being the key one. Just from your own political education work, for people who might be working in their local Labour Party or in local groups, what have you, do you have like one tip in terms of like delivering or organising political education?
That's a really big question, isn't it? One tip, yeah, do it. Actually, do it. I know we've had invitations from a few CLPs in Britain, in England in particular, to go because they have an education officer. Apparently, I don't know the structures, but it's at the bottom of the agenda. There's no funding. They're not very important. And if we come over to deliver a session, it probably wouldn't happen anyway. So then there's lessons there for local CLPs. If there's a left-wing CLP, political education needs to be moving up its agenda. That's the one thing I would do, because if you're going to colonise that left-wing space within the Labour Party that you've managed to you've got a kind of a beachhead there, I suppose you could argue, on the left compared to 5 years ago. Well, then you need to fortify that beachhead and start moving out from there. And political education is one of the ways you can do it, I suppose.
Cool. I'll grill you on that further later. Okay, very quickly, one last great question from Emma. It might be a bit too big to properly answer now, but I'll throw it out there. As the left, is it helpful or detrimental for us to have political education coming from many different organisations, places? The way I see it, this could be helpful as a way to present different points of view from different angles and include diverse voices, or this could be detrimental by dividing opinion rather than uniting us as a movement. At the left, should we be trying to unite political education under a common banner?
Yeah, I kind of go with the second part of that. I think there's an importance to identify, history, theory and praxis on this stuff. We need to really tie down some of the fundamental building blocks of left political education. I made the point before that TWT have done really good work over the last few years in, allowing us to identify as socialists and speak as socialists and talk and think like socialists, which wasn't always the case. I remember watching and I'll finish on this point, watching one of your programs from a couple of years ago. It was Grace Blakely sitting on a panel with David Miliband and a couple of other people. And she mentioned the words capital controls. And I was, fuck, this is good. The Labour Party is talking about capital controls. If you'd have mentioned that 2 years before in the Labour Party, you'd have been drummed out, as you would probably now, by the way, for mentioning it. But those are the kinds of political economy ideas that we need to be able to talk about and understand what it is. So yeah, that's. I think we do have to pin down some of the basic building blocks of political education. Otherwise, it just drifts off into meaningless nonsense.
Yeah, I think I agree too. All right, brilliant. Thanks, Stevie. I'm sure we'll hear from you later. All right, we're going to go to Jana now, who's got a really interesting looking presentation.
Let's hope. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm gonna, I think, pick up on a few threads. I'm kind of starting to brim with all kinds of other things I want to talk about, but I'm gonna stick to my ideas here. But basically, so I'm not talking about where I'm situated now. I'm right now the learning officer of my union branch in the UCU. It's a new role, and I'm thinking about political education in that union, as well as doing quite a bit of work in schools. So in the breakouts, I'd love to pick up on those things. But for right now, I was going to talk about something a bit more retrospective. I was asked to talk about the role of the arts and also organizing cultural workers. So I'm going to talk about a particular framework that's been really helpful for me that comes out of histories of popular education. The framework I'm talking about is called Naming the Moment and comes from sort of popular education movements in Latin America. And it was really interesting to hear Stevie talking about these worker centers, worker education centers that used to exist, because really formative to my training as an organizer in sort of altered globalization and anti-policing work in Canada and Toronto was the kind of prevalence of these centers of popular education training for movement activists. And in Toronto at the time, those movement activists were really influenced by groups like the Sandinistas and their education programs and other Central American programs that were very widespread, very popular, and very broad-based and incredibly effective as well in politicizing communities against government and neoliberalism. So naming the moment comes from, or the idea of it is that you look at the web of different forces that surround an issue and that determine different kind of opportunities for action, but that you also not only analyze, but kind of act on that analysis. And sort of the desire to also pass on the strategies within communities. So it's a process for analyzing conditions and for people who are maybe not already in a social movement to analyze their conditions, but also to act on them. And the process of doing that is understood as political education. So, and this is really maybe important for thinking about groups who are not already organized. You know, how do we do political education with people who are really disaffected, pissed off, but not necessarily in any kind of organization, you know, and any kind of activist group, any kind of trade union, etc. And this was the case for the case study that I'm going to talk about. This is a group I was involved with. I'm not representing the group today because we're a collective and we tend to speak in larger groups, but I'm using it as a case study to think through this kind of idea of naming the moment and some of the practices that are involved with it and other tools and strategies that come from popular education, but also really intersect with arts, kind of artistic and creative ways of getting people on board and getting people to analyze their conditions and understand why they're pissed off. So yeah, so I'm going to look at a case study of a group I was involved in called Precarious Workers Brigade. And this was about 2007. It was sort of led into the financial crisis and the anti-austerity movements, and is now being carried on by a number of different other groups. So the first phase, and naming the moment, that workbook I showed you, you know, it talks about phases, but these phases all happen generally at the same time and much more chaotically than the way I'm going to describe them right now. But the first phase is the sort of idea of how do you identify oneself or one's group and one's interests. You know, who are we? How are particular perspectives on race, gender, class, age, sector, etc. Shaping that perspective? So at the very onset, when we identify ourselves, it's not to say, you know, I am this, it's to really think about how those different perspectives shape who we are and who we think about ourselves. For us, when we were starting to organize cultural workers in the cultural sector in the UK in 2007, cultural workers didn't see themselves, for the most part, as workers, the ones that we were working with, particularly young people. We were working with a lot of young people who were doing endless internships, who were incredibly poor and not able to survive in the cultural sector. At that point, the cultural sector workers earned 60% less than the national average, and 75% of them had no pension. That's probably the same or worse right now, I would suspect. And we were working a lot with people around the chain of free labor, so the interns, but also the way that unpaid labor affects everybody in a sector. You know, if you're somebody who works in a gallery or in a film, you know, organization, and there's a lineup of 100 people willing to do your job for free, what does that mean? You know, that means that everybody in the whole chain is precarious. They don't want to speak up. They definitely don't want to describe themselves as workers. So we started to say, okay, who are we? We're a group of people who are affected by free labor. We started to use a motif because we started to find one of the characteristics of our experience together was that we were all like chasing this carrot that we never got to, and instead we were getting kind of hit on the head by the stick. You know, we were never getting that thing that we were promised, which was maybe a paid job or some kind of exciting work in the future. So we started to develop campaigns, but also just sort of motifs around this, around the carrot, and also just trying to get people to admit that A, they were workers, and B, they were exploited. And this was really tricky because there was a whole mantra in the arts that art is passion work, that you shouldn't get paid for it, you know, et cetera. So there's a whole ideology around that we had to break. And now that's in the air. Everybody kind of knows that in the cultural sector, that's problematic. In those days, if you went into a room of 100 art students and you said, you know, internships are problematic, people sort of booed you out of the room. So there was a real kind of shift in consciousness raising that needed to happen through some of these techniques. The second phase in this was sort of naming the issues and the struggles that are in people's lives and that they experience themselves. One really important part or aspect of this kind of political education that comes from pop ed is that the people who are asking these questions and who are doing the political education exist within those movements and those struggles. So this isn't political education from the outside coming in, it's people who share a set of conditions doing this work together. And so one of the things that we started to use was this format, which is the photo romance. And the photo romance was used by trade unionists in factories in Italy in the 1970s to mobilize workers, and particularly amongst women's groups. And the cultural sector and the people we were working with were, there were far more women than there were men in these kind of low paid or non-paid positions. So we were looking, and we were also thinking about people described in these kind of group meetings we had at the very beginning beginning how much they were driven by their own kind of desire. They wanted to be there. They loved the idea of being a cultural worker, and that sort of drove them and made it legitimate to be exploited endlessly. And so we started asking, you know, how does that happen? And we had people use theater techniques to play out these different scenarios of what their job looked like and what the feeling of exploitation felt like. So this is, you know, so we started to build our analysis of the issues through this kind of theatrical restaging of different moments and vignettes from their work lives. So, and we taught, you know, that's kind of revealed that education was crucial, that they were in universities and they were being told you should all go on multiple internships and work for free endlessly, that they were, while they were in their workplaces, they were being told, you know, you've just got to kind of keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. And they were, you know, this kind of, this thing that was supposed to happen never did, that they would get an opportunity, like they'd work on a book and they'd work endlessly and then they'd have no credit, they'd not be credited for it, and they wouldn't be paid. And we started also develop these tools that people could use to start negotiating other kinds of conditions for themselves. But one of the things that we realized in all of this work was that, and this little warning on this bust your boss card is maybe indicative of this, in the cultural sector, your boss may not look like your boss, they could be your friend or your drinking buddy, they could even be you. So this was like a really also important aspect that we had to kind of think about together. And then we, phase 3 of naming the moment is assessing the forces. What is it that, and this is the political economy question that we were just hearing about, you know, like what are the forces historically that produce this condition? And so we were looking at, for example, the history of internships, who started internships and why. We looked at this history of what was called the people pipeline at the turn of the 20th or the 19th century, which was about how do you create a workforce, and essentially a relatively precarious workforce that originally began as sort of the idea of the apprenticeship, but actually over time becomes sort of really reduced to this role that is actually fundamental to the exploitation, chains of exploitation in the economy. And also its kind of end point is programs like workfare that the government, you know, institutes around free labor. We also set up something, this is a really important popular education tool, a people's tribunal, where people could come together and share testimony against their employers, where in lieu of places where there actually is a process for acknowledging a problem, people's tribunals are really amazing at bringing people together and actually sort of speaking amongst each other in relation to the conditions that they're facing. And our analysis kind of deepened through these, through this people's tribunal, where we started to really think about, okay, what are the dynamics of exploitation? The internship is one, but migration and immigration policy and racism in the arts is another really crucial one that's kind of working alongside this free labor. So how could we then divide our campaign into these different subsets and groups who are working on different issues? And this is us supporting cleaners and recognizing that cultural workers are everyone who works in and around cultural institutions, not only the people who, you know, are training to be curators or artists or something like that, that everybody who's involved is a cultural worker on some level. Finally, planning for action. In our case, we did, you know, we were working alongside many forces, many groups in the anti-austerity campaigns. We developed a lot of actions in front of cultural institutions. This one's in front of the ICA, take your carrot and shove it. We wore masks. A lot of the cultural workers didn't want to be identified. They felt they'd be singled out. So people wore masks as donkeys and played out these kind of motifs. And I guess we were also asked, okay, was it successful? Well, certainly, you know, one of our projects was to work alongside trade unions. So one of the things that we were doing was really consciousness raising, and then trying to get people then in cultural sites to bolster up or organize trade union branches, or, you know, become part of a larger union efforts. And we were working really in conjunction with unions who were working on the internship issue from a different perspective. But our remit was, we felt, to get people to even understand themselves as workers, this kind of consciousness raising piece. So, you know, certain policies did shift. Government doesn't fund cultural institutions now who do unpaid internships. Those cultural institutions have found other workarounds. There's still campaigning going on around that. But, you know, we made some wins, and our biggest win was that now when you talk to a group of art students or a group of young people, they understand that this is a problematic practice, and they want to, you know, get involved in these kinds of organizing efforts. But today I wanted to just give a shout out also to migrants in culture, the grassroots unions like United Voices of the World, Designers and Cultural Workers Group, IWGB Cultural Workers Group. There's a lot of unions now organizing in different places, and I think that comes out of that really incredible moment, which was our moment of Precarious Workers Brigade, but also many other groups who are working together to produce a kind of dynamic around this issue. So the other thing I just wanted to end on is just that naming the moment is also, I mean, in Toronto back in the 2000s, early 2000s, it was we used naming the moment as a way for movement groups to get together from across really different practices and to really name the kind of the neoliberal crisis together, to analyze it and to form alliances, and really a kind of concerted effort on a sort of joint effort on how we were going to approach political education in that city and in the province, and how we were going to produce campaigns that worked together. And I think that that's another thing that's very important about those processes, is that they allow for broad-based groups to come together and to sort of think together about how they're going to approach the moment. And I think this moment is one that is ripe for such a process. I'm involved in a few of them, and I'm sure lots of people here are, but this kind of mapping across our movements and forming a strategy together feels really crucial, you know, as part of our political education. So I will end there.
Thanks, Jenna. That was amazing. That was a brilliant presentation, and yeah, really interesting to learn about. Before TWT, I was quite skeptical of PowerPoint presentations, but actually Stevie and Shawnee did one for their event earlier on, and this is the other one I've seen, and they've both been amazing. And maybe we do need to, in this new age, think about PowerPoints as a really important resource for political education and how we can embed that in. We're running a little bit behind. I had one question that maybe is a bit too big, but I just wanted to see if you had a quick answer for it. I guess like the idea of like doing political education and organizing with precarious workers comes with lots of issues that I've spoken about quite a lot, in terms of the fact that people you're working with are precarious, and they might not be around for very long. They might be moving between jobs. And so interest in the kind of influence of the Italian tradition, but I guess in that context, they were mainly organizing in factories where people had more solid jobs. There's a bigger question around the issues there for organizing, but I just wanted to ask quickly about specifically around political education. Like, something we don't talk about that much is that political education takes time in lots of ways, in one sense. Sometimes it doesn't take time. We've seen with Black Lives Matter recently, this incredible teachable moment when, in, you know, the blink of an eye, Britain's history is being reevaluated, and obviously in America, you know. So I just wondered if you just had a comment on that, like the issue of doing political education with people who might be in and out and are precarious.
I mean, this is something that we faced always, was just that people's conditions were changing constantly. So someone might have been an intern, and then they were working in a pub, and then they were, you know, doing something else. I mean, I think one of the things, and this is what we've seen with Black Lives Matter, we were a little bit before this current social media moment when we were doing this work, but there was a certain way in which the sort of imaginary that was produced around the carrot, around the idea that you could be a dissenter, produced a kind of framework for people's political education on a certain level. So I wouldn't do that without the kind of really grassroots stuff that we were doing, but there was something important about the fact that you could, like, there was something out there you could identify with, and that would give you a path to maybe learn more or to think more around those issues. The other thing was that we used the infrastructures of the people exploiting us. So we used the galleries. If we got invited to give a talk, we would turn it into a people's tribunal, or we would turn it into a photo romance session, or so we were constantly in those spaces where the people were. So it didn't mean that everybody was involved in the whole process, but it meant that we were able to kind of catch people as they were moving through places, which was crucial. And I mean, we had a moment where people, we were like a bit, they thought that we were artists, when we were organizers, but that sort of smuggling in that moment was helpful, because it meant that we could turn those moments of being treated like we were artists into organizing moments. And that was a very stated political aim for us, was that we have to, not get into the trap of feeling like we made it or something like that. But that we had to actually, every opportunity, every moment that we were involved in anything cultural was an organizing moment. So I'm thinking about, how do we transfer those to other kinds of spaces? But I think, it's about being in the places that people are, basically. I mean, sometimes we did a whole campaign where we went out on to cafes in Shoreditch, and we were we were like talking to people in the cafes in Shoreditch, because that's where they were all freelancing. And that we thought, where is the factory of the freelance cultural worker? Okay, it's like all those cafes where everybody's sitting with their laptop and working. So I think, it's also about sort of thinking about, where do the factories exist, because they still exist in some ways, they're just not centralized. So, but yeah, it's a good question. And the transience is really tough. It's really, really hard. Some people have to commit for the long haul, and lots of us did, and that was crucial. If we had all been precarious and not committed to our organizing work, it wouldn't have worked. And so I think that is something that you have to instill, that commitment is a really crucial dimension of being part of political education, but also movement work. And that was a big shift for everybody. That was a political education for us as organizers, and us as people who worked in culture. That was something we had to allocate actually a lot of time to, that we had to sacrifice things about our cultural work to do the organizing work, which became our new kind of cultural work. And that, that's also a bit of a shift. We've all had that shift, I'm sure, in our organizing lives,
Thanks, Jana. That was brilliant. So we've had 3 brilliant provocations and sharings of experience and knowledge. So yeah, we're a bit behind, but we've still got plenty of time for proper group discussions and then feedback. So I think Andrew is gonna introduce the breakout. Or actually, Andrew, do you want to come in? Are we doing a little stretch before that, or should we have 30 seconds?
We will be, as part of what I'm about to say. So we're going to have a quick screen break, and then after these, the breakout rooms, we all have a full break. But so we've moved from some really interesting speakers. Thanks everybody, and it's great to see all of the people on the call beyond the speakers as well. We're going to move from a passive section to an active section with some breakout groups. So the purpose of these breakouts are to get you guys thinking strategically about political education in your context. So I'm just going to tell you about that. I'm going to show you some slides that we're going to use, and then we'll have 2 minutes whilst we're setting up the breakout rooms to have a quick stretch, have a walk. I put fast toilet, but I'm not sure what that means exactly. But so the breakout rooms themselves contain 3 tasks. So first of all, there'll be a small group of 5 of you in each. You just need to give a brief description of the context in which you might be doing some political education. What the context that you're operating in, the form of the political education you're involved in, or that you wish to be involved in, and whether you are changing the world. So that's an important part to think about. So think about the situation, community that it's taking place in, the audience, format, inspiration, that kind of thing. Then the second task is to have collectively brainstorm those things. Think about the kind of things that we've been talking about in these interesting talks about who should you be targeting? How would you be doing? How can you do these things? And then at the very end, it'd be great if you could come out collectively with a key question out of that discussion. So I'm just going to post the slides, breakout slides, in the chat there. So if you click on those, you will be able to go to a room via the page that you see. If you all just, when you get put into the breakout room, spot your breakout room number and then go to the same one on the slide, and then you'll see some questions to help you make some notes. There'll be facilitators in a lot of the groups, but not all of them. So nominate someone to make some notes if you'd like, or any of you can. The idea is that everyone gets a chance to discuss their scenario. If you don't have one of your own, it's fine to make one up. Or if you just want to join in the conversation about the others, that's completely fine as well. Okay, so if you find your way to those slides and those kinds of things now, we'll let Jamila put us all into our groups, and we'll take 2 minutes just to have a quick stand up, walk around, and we'll come back and we'll jump straight in. Okay, so see you in 2 minutes.
Okay, so I think, so what we're going to do, we're a little bit over time, but I think that's fine if everyone's up for just like maybe going 10 minutes over. Because I think it's really important to kind of bring these discussions to a kind of, you know, a kind of summary and like where we go next. I think, Jess, did you have the kind of like summary questions that we were going to kind of pose back to the
Yes, I think it's the one from the group that Laura was in around kind of how, well, I guess for the first question, how we kind of prioritize political education when there's so much else going on, and how do we kind of get people excited about a political education project when, you know, there's a lot of other things on people's plates. Might be a good one to start with.
Stevie, did you want to start? Did you want to answer first and then go to Jana, Dami?
Sorry, answer or ask. So I didn't get a chance to throw our question in, but it was kind of similar to that one. As how do you move beyond the platitude of saying we need to do more political education and then doing nothing, which could nearly sums up the whole debate, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
No, exactly. I would go back to my point before that political education has to be outside of and underneath electoral cycles. It has to be constant, it has to be deep rooted, it has to be long term, it has to be fucking hard, and we have to just keep doing it and not letting electoralism, if you like, I suppose, interrupt it, which is what it does at meetings, is what it does at conferences. It just drops off the agenda because it's not considered important, and then we end up in 2017, pivoting around Remain and all that kind of nonsense that destroyed your chances in 2019 because there was a serious lack of knowledge about in terms of political education. I mean, if I was in your position, I'd be giving everyone a history of Labourism. I get them to read Ralph Miliband's book in the 60s about, the Labour Party leads people up the hill and then leads people down again. It's done it 3 or 4 times in the last 80 years. That understanding would maybe stop us doing it or stop you lot doing it again and again and again. That's a bit critical there, but I'm a critical friend from the outside.
And I think one of the things is it's like, because there's 2 elements to this whole debate, isn't there? There's like the doing of political education and the best forms for doing that. And we've heard you guys speak about that. And I guess one thing to say there is that like there are lots of different ways to skin a cat, and like there's no one scientific method for it's context specific. But the other thing, which is I guess the important thing at the moment, is really pushing it onto the agenda, as you're saying. Like how do we kind of force our local groups and whatever context we're working in to take it really seriously, and I think a really practical way in which we can do that, and we'll talk about this a bit at the end, is like building more of a kind of collective movement around socialist education and political education, and sharing ways in which we found useful to kind of like make that case and make that argument. It's a campaign in a way, a campaign for political education, I guess. Jammer, I don't know if you had anything to kind of say to that. No worries if not.
What? Sorry, are you asking me?
I guess the question was, yeah, like well, do you want to say the question again quickly, Jess? It was.
Yeah, I guess it's how do we make sure that political education is still kind of on the table when people are so busy with, you know, lots of other things? How do we make it a priority?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think when you were talking about that, I was thinking just about how political education, when we talk about it, a lot of times people think we mean like somebody's going to stand up and teach everybody, and people have kind of go like, that's not important. You know, there's other people, there's places that do that teaching. I think maybe if we can talk about it more as a way of building membership, that's, you know, potentially, because actually that is what good political education does. It's an organizing tool. It allows people to analyze their conditions and sort of come into a realization of that with other people. So it is, but, you know, it's not like a membership drive. It doesn't conform to the way that we understand membership now, like, you know, knocking on doors and trying to convince people to join, but actually gets, you know, it's consciousness raising work. And I think maybe if we sort of also look at that, I think also that there's just a lot of infrastructure. In my group, we were talking about how there's a lot of infrastructures that have been lost to sort of skill-based training, which is incredibly important and still needs to exist. But there's been like a real separation between that sort of skill-based training and the political analysis and political education work. And there's actually like a lot of community education spaces, not as many as there once were. There are, you know, foundation colleges. There are lots of spaces where, you know, we could be doing that work. That would then also bring more people into these different kinds of I guess, organizing practices, whether it's the Labour Party or some other kind of organizing practice, momentum, etc. So I think in some ways that seems, you know, important to talk about it in relationship to base building, basically, because that's how I understand political education. It's base building. It's not about educating people. It's about how do you build an effective movement. And if you look at all of the Latin American stuff, that's what it was. They were doing literacy campaigns at the same time as they were building people's political analysis and their skill set for fighting the powers that were oppressing them. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jenna. Maybe it'd be good to just hear a little bit of feedback from some of the groups. So I don't know if any of the facilitators just want to jump in, or anyone who was a kind of like nominated as a spokesperson for their groups just want to give kind of quick summaries of the discussions that they had. Just go for it, guys. I mean, there's plenty of people here who...
I can kick off if you want. So a lot of us in our group were sort of coming from like a rural area, and it was CLP based things. And so a lot of what we talked about was some of these new technologies that people have learned to use. And we talked about how can we connect with people on a wider and with a wider scope from the you know, speaking to the public, not just to members, looking at how we connect with people regionally and how we can use technology to do that. And then we also talked about simple things like leading with issues when we're looking at political education projects, rather than say leading with a Labour Party or whatever. So they're just a couple of brief points that we discussed.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got Lorcan.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just it seemed like from our discussion that kind of a lot of people were operating in kind of slightly right-wing or hostile CLPs and contexts, and so I think that we talked about kind of some of the challenges around doing this sort of thing in that kind of context, especially if you kind of don't want to get labelled or you know, kind of attacked as being kind of on the left. So that kind of thing, and sort of the question that we came to at the end of it was, is it a mistake to be focusing too much energy inside the Labour Party now with the change of situation, and the, you know, the sort of the short term gains versus the kind of long term gains of building something, and maybe that something involves more activity outside the party.
Brilliant, thanks, Lorcan. Did someone want to jump in next? Obviously, there's lots of like stuff being thrown up here, and I will talk about, we have a forum that's been set up to carry on these discussions, and I'll talk about concrete ways in which we can carry them on at the end, but I'll just let it flow for now. Does anyone else from one of the groups want to jump in?
Max, do you fancy, like, so I was in group 7 and we had like an interesting question about, you know, who, and it was kind of related to Dami, but do you want to ask it, Max? It's Max Bass. Oh, I will unmute. Jamila, can you unmute Max Baster? Is that possible?
Great, yeah. Yeah, loads of really interesting stuff came up in us. I think one of the things that a lot of us had kind of overlap in was how you kind of approach things on our own terms, and you avoid either working with institutions that in the end don't want to make adequate changes. So that was the example of sort of local NGOs, for example, and also discussing things on terms that have been set up by the right or by the centre, where we were talking about things like, I suppose, the kind of current culture wars, diversions onto faulty towers instead of kind of the material demands of Black Lives Matter, for example. That they get to set up those terms, and these are really important things to win long term. But I think, yeah, there was this kind of problem and trap of falling into collaborating with the wrong people or being defined in our discourse by the wrong people, I think.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, I think that's really important. I think one thing that we definitely need to think about on the left as people organising around education is how we can be prepared for these teachable moments. So like how we can be prepared with the resources, the workshops, the ideas and the framing for when something like Black Lives Matter explodes and the culture war intensifies, like we can be there already and we're not kind of chasing our tail. I think that's a really key thing. And obviously that's about like developing workshops, etc., and like thinking, building our political education out of the current climate, like being able to kind of, you know, and that requires us also, I think, as educators, like being willing to learn and to like engage and not come at it from a position of like superiority, or, you know, from a place of like we already understand and everything we read Marx and we know exactly what to say. Maybe we'll take like 1 or 2 more groups to feedback before we kind of I'll come back to the speakers at the end. Did Cynthia want to feedback?
Hello, I've been unmuted, so maybe it's my turn.
Oh, go for it.
Hi, yeah, we were in Breakout Room 2, and I guess the common kind of theme that we were looking at was that we all come from different sort of backgrounds, but we're trying to set up new education movements or whatever. So in a CLP, or I'm doing stuff with Labour for a Green New Deal. And so, yeah, that was kind of a thing that we touched on, was like how it's a bit hot right now to like political education is like a thing that people are talking about, which is really great. But we were sort of asking like, how can we as a movement share expertise between different groups, different parts of the movement, different traditions, so that we're sort of united in what we're teaching people, but also to sort of facilitate like intergenerational and inter-organizational learning. And yeah, I guess like touched on how spaces where people from different traditions, different backgrounds feel comfortable to be educated and to educate are important, but also the ability to facilitate an exchange between these different people, different traditions, whatever, like the importance of that as well as a whole movement. Yeah, so that was kind of what we were up to.
Brilliant, thanks Emma. Yeah, and I think that thing of like developing intergenerational solidarity is something that is really important for the left at the moment. And I think TWT has lots of limitations in terms of like, it's still a very white audience. you know, it's still like, you know, people mainly from the cities, although I think that's changing quite a lot. But you know, it's got its limitations. But the one thing I think we've managed to do quite well, or what we managed to attract, is like, you know, quite a lot of people who are over 60, and then quite a lot of young people as well, people kind of in and around 30 or younger. And for me, that's been one of the great experiences of TWTC, and that exchange between. And I think at the moment, you know, in a kind of post-Brexit context where there is this kind of generational divide within society, I think creating those spaces to overcome that is incredibly important, and have a kind of passing down knowledge and also passing up knowledge kind of mentality. I think that's a really important thing.
Not at all. Well, Cynthia very eloquently spoke about the importance of getting a broadsheet to older people in along town communities, mostly because of countering the impact from the Daily Mail, and how this is actually quite a realistic thing that we can do, because you can do it in your CLPs, but it can be nationally organised so that it doesn't have to be a huge amount of specific writing, just a column to specific issues locally in the CLP perhaps, but in general a national one, but just one sheet perhaps a week.
Right. Yeah, and I think that kind of crossover between what we're talking about as political education and the other real necessity of building alternative media, given, you know, the state of the media at the moment. And like, we need more than just Novara for that. We need local led, you know, media initiatives, and there are some brilliant ones like the Bristol Cable, etc. But yeah, like, I think that's another area where we definitely need to build. Okay, unless anyone has a burning thing to say, I don't want to go too over time. So, okay, Vicky's looks like she's got a burning thing. If you can be quick, Vicky, and then I'll go to the speakers. Just unmuting you. There you go.
It was just to add on to that, we did start doing a broadsheet before COVID came in. But the other thing that I was saying I've been doing is putting up window posters in my street, asking questions, political questions. Whose responsibility is it that there was no publicly owned testing, etc., etc. And people in the street have actually come along and said, when I've been out in the street, have come along and said, that's really good what you've put, people you've never spoken to before. So the idea of broadsheets and, you know, as alternatives to social media and stuff, posters are quite useful, because people have got used to posters being up in the window.
Brilliant, thanks, Vicky. Yeah, and I think that's another thing that we haven't really touched on, but I guess it's a key question for us as the left at the moment. Like, how do we use the teachable moment that is COVID as a point in which to kind of, you know, push socialist ideas and try and, even if it's very locally, take charge of the narrative? And I think it's a real opportunity, given the lack of faith in the government at the moment, for like, it's a space where like the odd conversation can make a real difference, I think. So I'm sorry if I've kind of missed anyone. It's quite hard to navigate the whole screen as well. But I'm gonna go back to the speakers to see if you've got any kind of final words or like responses to any of the comments made and the questions. Jana, do you want to go first?
No, give me a sec, because I'm still looking at these questions. Sorry, as they're coming in. I'm kind of engrossed in the chat.
Stevie, did you have anything to say?
I'm only going to repeat myself, but I'm happy to do that anyway. I appreciate the people's enthusiasm for, you know, rejuvenating their political education at CLP level or momentum level or wherever they're organised, but there's also a role in this outside of all of that, as I said again, for long-term kind of deep organising, deep education that does not lose its energy when an election comes along. In fact, it might intensifies when there's an election, and we don't have that anywhere. And I think there's a real we're really missing a trick on that one. Some of you know that we were doing some work with the Democracy Collaborative in America, and they used the model of the Highlander folk school in the 1930s in the States. You know, Rosa Parks didn't just turn up on a bus and decide not to get up. She spent a month at the Highlander folk school before that, working with people there, working with, yes, evangelical Christians, and yes, communists, yes, trade union organisers. And we need that. We need those kinds of institutions, and they don't build themselves, and they don't fund themselves. And I really think there's a real kind of need for that here, those rooted, resourced kind of institutions. And we've lost all of them nearly. And we've got an awful fucking lot to build, because we've been under a 40-year attack here, so we don't have much time left. Sorry, that sounds really fucking depressing there, excuse me.
Well, no, I mean, it's true though, isn't it? And we have to be realistic about where we are. I think that's really important. And, you know, like the few of us, you know, on this call and people we know who are trying to do this, we need to build stronger relationships, because, you know, like the institutions aren't just going to drop out of the clouds, right? And as Stevie says, it is a long-term project. And I think like everyone's been gutted by the defeats of the last election, but I think there's starting to be a real understanding and willingness that you know, as the saying now goes, there is no shortcut to socialism. Like, it's a long struggle, and, you know, for me that's also quite exciting. You know, it's stressful at one level, but it's exciting at another. It gives our lives meaning, right? in an otherwise dark world. Jana, any final words?
Yeah, I really agree with what Stevie was saying about these education centers or places, drop-ins, spaces that hold resources. And I'd be really, because I mean, it was absolutely crucial for me in the movements I've been involved in, but I'm from a generation before, you know, we organized online. So I'm quite interested in like maybe a discussion about that. What is the form that takes? Because now, you know, obviously we saw a lot of really interesting education work going on through social media during Black Lives Matter, but then it sort of sparks up and disappears. So I'm trying to figure out like what's the relationship between, you know, these CLPs and potentially having kind of local grassroots education centers that are maybe doing broadsheets, maybe doing work, theater of the oppressed, maybe doing coffee, you know, depending what the local kind of situation is and what the analysis of the situation is, but where these kinds of spaces can pop up and people can kind of drop in and just learn some stuff, you know, and that they don't have to pay their Labour Party membership to do that also, which I think came up in my discussion, that you know, people can't pay for all of this anymore. And so how do we figure out a kind of dynamic around that? So, and then, yeah, so how do you create those kind of very localized, identifiable spaces and programs that run out of them? And then how do you do the kind of thing online at the same time? But I think somehow we need an absolute metronome that keeps this as a practice that isn't just responding to, you know, whatever's happening that day. And that's the kind of difficulty of right now, is that we're sort of hopping from one thing to the next. We kind of maybe feel sometimes things are building, but we're not catching that over time. So I mean, and I think in addition to maybe those kind of localized practices, I do think we need to somehow like find the people who are disaffected in education spaces, because there's a lot of them. You know, there's a lot of teachers who are disaffected. There's a lot of community educators who used to be part of more radical programs in the 70s and now are like stuck in these really neoliberal kinds of community education programs. And you know, potentially trying to gather more educators who are on the ground and trying to work with them to think about those practices that already exist, those existing kind of spaces and infrastructures for education. And I was a part of this group called Radical Education Forum that still exists, which is a group for teachers to come together and develop resources, but something, you know, on a larger scale, on a national scale, that brought different kinds of teachers together who are already in spaces of education would also be really helpful.
Thanks, Jana. And Stevie and Jana, and Dami's gone unfortunately, but like, thank you for your contributions. They've been amazing. And, you know, yes, there's like lots of questions and lots of work to be done. But I think it's just really important in this moment that we are just asking these questions again and again, and like thinking about how we can take them forward. People are posting a lot of stuff in the chat. Just going to do, the people were talking about podcasts, and I do think podcasts are becoming such a key part of the education like terrain. Stevie's posted the Trademark podcast, which is a brilliant, there's a history of capitalism on there that's brilliant, and there's loads of great stuff. We've just started a new podcast, The World Transformed, over the festival, which is a bit of an experiment in education. So it'd be great if everyone could have a listen. Like, we're trying to take a kind of wide angle view on different topics, and it's a kind of mixture of like academics talking about concepts, but also activists talking about their experience and kind of cultural history around different themes. So check that out. Okay, so we've had lots of discussions. As I kind of like mentioned at the start, TWT is trying to develop this, or is in the process of developing what we're calling a political education network, which basically breaks down into us building a resource hub on our website, which is up, and I think Jam is posting a link to at the moment, where we're sharing workshop templates and like different resources for political education, including a guide to building your own transformed group. It also includes us supporting transform groups and running trainings, which we've been piloting over the last year, which we've run throughout this festival, and which we're going to continue to run and develop. But then also, I guess, like key to that is just creating a space for people interested in political education, sharing ideas, sharing research, and wanting to you know, run events in their area, to kind of come together and stay in touch. And most of you will know that we've been running a forum throughout the festival, and there's a particular thread for the Political Education Network. I think it's being posted in the chat, if I'm right. Is that right, Jam? And the idea is that this thread will outlast the festival, and we'll use it to continue developing the network. Another key thing that Jana mentioned was, yeah, like, so one thing that we also want to do is build a speakers network where we can make it much easier for groups to access academics, educators, activists to talk at events. So that's another area. So basically, join the forum. We're also going to send out an email to everyone who's come along with a lot of the links and stuff that's come out of this session, and also just information about how you can stay involved. But people had already started chatting on the forum beforehand about this session, which was really exciting. So it'd be great if everyone could get on that. You should have received an email that gives you a link to join the forum. If you haven't, or if there's any issues, just email info@theworldtransformed.org if you want to put that in, Jamila. But as I say, we'll send an email to everyone who's been in this workshop with more information about that. So yeah, like, there's lots of stuff happening with TWT. We're trying to make it as like, we're trying to turn it into something that everyone can like participate in and be involved in as much as possible. So yeah, just follow those links and read the emails, and it will become clearer how you can be involved and stay in touch. Last few announcements. First of all, I just want to say a massive thanks to Andrew, Jess, and Peter, and Fiona, who have put this session together. They put a huge amount of work into it, and to all the facilitators who have also helped as well, and to Jamila for doing the tech, and to all of you for participating in the session and like bringing all your knowledge and ideas and experiences. It's been really brilliant. It's really tough to do on Zoom. I know, Stevie, you've talked about it before, you hate doing political education online because, you know, it's so much better in person, but we've all made the best of it this year. I just want to do a shout out to there's a film screening. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Peter, could you just jump in and do a shout out?
Yeah. So it's at 5, and it's 3 films, and it's called Imagining Political Education. And it's a film by Ed Webb-Ingall, which is about forming a residents association, which I think is from the sort of 60s or 70s, I think, but super relevant now, I'm sure. Then there's a film which actually references it, which is by Kristen Luke, who's a contemporary artist working in a community in North Wales. And she was working as part of a council estate, sort of on a residency there. And then I've forgotten the name of the and there's another one about sort of political education in Italy, and it's a bit more of a historical film, and I've forgotten its name. but the screening, there's a link for the screening in the chat now, so go check it out.
Brilliant, thanks. And then finally, as always, just going to do a plug for our supporters network. Like, if you do want to see the world transform, develop into the kind of institution we need in terms of political education, please consider joining the supporters network. We've managed to get just over 100 people joining during the festival. We need to get something like 50 more by the end of the weekend to be able to continue doing the projects we're doing and running the festival next year. So if you're not already a supporter and you can afford it, please consider joining. It would be really helpful. And I think that is it. Last thing to say is a comradely goodbye. That's on my list. So I'm going to say thank you very much, comrades, and let's carry on the struggle and build political education together.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.